deep factory, uprising, occupation, and cooperative. I want to thank Shani Pierre and Fanny Gues for hosting us here at the Maison Française. This event is sponsored by the Maison Française, by the ICLS, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the CCCCT, the Columbia Center for CCCT for Contemporary Critical Thought. It's a pleasure to be here with Étienne. This all started actually last summer when Étienne and I were having a wonderful meal in Paris talking about cooperatives and cooperation, and Étienne said, "Oh, this incredible moment that we're going to see this evening had been so inspiring for him and his visit." I want to hear about the visit as well. But so we're here with Étienne Balibar, who needs no introduction, a colleague here at Columbia University, philosopher, author of extraordinary texts on Marx and Spinoza and others. And so Étienne is going to give us a little introduction to the movie before we start the screening. I want to give a big thanks to Léa Honorat, who did the translations to English.
We'll see, of course, this in a minute, but I'm sure your subtitles are perfect, but I imagine that this was not a very easy task, because lots of people speak together and the language is sometimes familiar and so on. So thank you so much.
And thanks again to Fanny and also Kiana Tagavi for organizing all this. All right, so.
Okay, so I will try, control me please, and not make this infinite, because we want to see the movie, and I'm sure that, and I hope, and I thank you for being here, thank you for imagining that this could be an interesting thing to view or view again and discuss about. It has more than indirect ties, I would say, with the subject of Bernard's seminars this year and his general reflection about cooperation. But perhaps we leave the concepts aside for a minute and we talk just about the event in the plot, so to speak. Now, this movie was, if I'm not mistaken, I checked on Wikipedia, was made in the 1980s, and so it is about an event. There's no other story, if you like. I don't find any simple terms that has become, in a sense, almost mythical, and in any case emblematic of a certain moment of France's social, political, intellectual history, which is the strike. And all these elements are combined, but we might talk about the specificity of that combination later. It's a strike. It's of workers from a watch factory. Can you say that? Leap, which at the time was rather famous. It didn't make luxury watches, but it made good watches, and they were technologically and aesthetically, I would say, somewhat ahead of others. So it was fairly well known. And the factory is located in a suburb of the beautiful ancient city of Besançon, which is the capital city, the main city of the old province Franche-Comté, free county, so to speak, located at the edge of the French territory to the east, near the Swiss border. And this perhaps we'll come back to that. It's something interesting and important to know because it's, of course, it's part of the background, the social and moral, I would say, and professional background of the protagonists. This is a region which for centuries, in fact, or decades in any case, has been specialized in the construction, the fabrication of watches. There's a very long tradition, beginning with craftsmen, artisans, and continuing with workers. And of course, these workers are very skilled workers. And of course, Swiss watches are world famous, but the region in France where the good watches are made is part of the same region. Now the events took place shortly after the famous uprising of May 68. So it's not directly part of May 68. It's not a direct continuation, but we also can return to that. The traces of May 68 are extremely perceptible both in the kind of action that the workers undertook and in their motives and their ideology. Now, in the years that followed May 68, I mean, the great, so May 68, also that's, I believe, important to know, had been characterized by mass demonstrations, uprisings, barricades, etc., but also, and perhaps above all, by a huge movement of occupation of factories, which renewed a long tradition, coming back, revolutionary tradition in many respects, tracing back to the Popular Front, etc. So the idea of occupying the factory is something that comes to some extent from 68, except that in 68, of course, the workers occupied the factories, all small factories, big factories, all France. I mean, I remember I was living already with my wife Françoise, who is here tonight, in the same district in the southern edge of Paris, near Porte d'Italie. But this has changed today. There are no longer factories, but at the time there were big factories there, engines for planes, etc. They were all covered with red flags, etc. Fortresses, etc. But they did not produce. The factories were stopped. Okay, let's. And then an important element of the background also. Yes. Okay. So after 68, a wave of strikes continued. Very different strikes against conditions of work, particularly strikes of immigrant workers in the automobile industry. The immigrants in the automobile industries are unskilled workers. They are exploited, so to speak, in a terrorist where these are, I repeat, very high-skilled workers. And also, that's the two emblematic events, almost simultaneously communicated to some extent, were on the one side the Lip occupation, and on the other side the movement of revolutionary peasants who occupied and transformed into a kind of free zone. It wasn't exactly the Zapatistas of today, but there's a little flavor of that. In the south west of France, the Larzac plateau, because they opposed the decision of the state to seize their land and transform it into a huge military training camp. So this gives the general atmosphere. Now the succession of events and the chronology is the following. What the film refers to is only the first part of the story, but it's also the most interesting and the most spectacular. the whole story lasted, in fact, from 1973 to 1980. That's 7 years. And what we see in the movie concerns the first 2.5 years. And essentially, there are 2 episodes. So the movie, as I should have said, I hope you follow me, is a combination, artistic combination of documents from which had been shot at the time of the events themselves, and interviews with some of the protagonists of the strike who retrospectively, not only workers, and explain that in a minute, who retrospectively comment, narrate, comment on what they had done at the time, and draw some lessons for themselves and in general of the whole story. So it's continuously shifting from the pure documentary aspect to the reflexive aspect, the conversation with protagonists who, of course, are now 20 years older, if not more. It all began in the spring of 1973 because the factory was losing money. It was nearly bankrupt, if you like, and in such cases, very often the owner of the factory, in fact, it was a family capitalist, Fred Liep, decided to sell his factory to other capitalists. But of course, the condition, this is very frequent, under which somebody accepted to reprendre, as we say in French, to take back or to install the factory, was laying off about half of the workers. So incidentally, the workers were about 1,000, and they were mainly women, which is an important, not purely, but mainly women. So the factory could continue with a new owner, provided half of the workers be fired to make economies. So the workers, there exists the law and the legislation is that such decision can be made only after a meeting has taken place, which where you have the managers on one side, financials maybe, and you have the representatives of the workers on the other side, that is to say trade unionists, essentially elected by their fellow workers. And the trade unionists very quickly, so you see some of them were very remarkable figures, they quickly understood that they were not told everything. So, and they were extremely, and the workers were very, very tense, anxious. So they detained the managers, prevented them from leaving the room, scrapped some of their attaché case, their
belongings, yeah. Their papers.
Yes, and opened them and found the whole plan of laying off half of the workers. So immediately this was communicated to the workers, and in the spirit of previous strikes, etc., the workers decided to seize the factory, and this was, of course, a collective movement. All the decisions were made in general assemblies, of course. But the leadership, so to speak, of the movement, interestingly, was a combination, very revealing of the period, of, on the one side, elected trade unionists, and on the other side, a so-called Comité d'Action, Action Committee, very much in the spirit of May 68, which represented the so-called spontaneous movement and initiative of the workers. So they seized the factory, And in order to resist an assault that was, of course, very likely to take place quickly on the side of the police, so they made something other. You'll see they are very proud of that, and which was a remarkable initiative. The factory had a collection of like 25,000, I believe, new watches ready to be sold. So the workers took the watches and decided to hide them, not in the factory itself, but in the countryside, in various places, using the good relations that many of them, this is very much a local province phenomenon, had with peasants, even former ties dating to the resistance period, and so on and so on. So they, what's the past tense of hiding?
They hid.
They hid.
Yeah.
They hid the watches, and then progressively they started to sell them, because their key idea, their main idea was, of course, that they should continue to receive a salary. But that was not enough. They decided to start again the production, and they invented an extraordinary motto which became famous throughout France. On produit, on vend, on se paie. We produce, we sell, we pay our own salaries. Hence a new question that you will see discussed in the film. Which salaries should they pay? And of course the rule in such factories that women and men usually don't have the same salary because they are not equally skilled, blah blah. And of course there's a whole scale of it. So another decision that they made after disputes that you will see recorded instead was to pay absolutely equal salaries to each and every of the members. So there's a sort of communism there, but we can discuss that. So that lasted about 6 months. I believe, I hope I'm not wrong. A huge movement of solidarity started in France. You'll see pictures of the huge demonstration in the streets of Besançon, 100,000 people coming from all over the country. And the city itself has 120,000 inhabitants. That included, of course, representatives of leftist groups, and also people who would play an extremely important role in the whole story, that is members of, I would say, kind of reformist, modernist wing of the left, complicated, the left of the Socialist Party, whose main leader later became Prime Minister, blah blah, called Michel Rocard. And I mention this for the following reason. In October of the same year, the Prime Minister of the time had decided that it was enough. And that was the obsession of the government in the following period. This should stop because it's an extremely bad example that other workers in the country might want to follow. Enough with all that spirit. So the Prime Minister loudly declared, "Lip c'est fini," lip is over. But at this moment, a group, so the second phase begins. So the police assaulted, in fact, the factory, and the workers were forced to abandon their buildings and their work. But they did not give back the watches, which they had, and not immediately. And then a group of progressive capitalists, mainly coming from what we call in French the HSP, la Haute Société Protestante, the High Protestant Society. people who have very famous names in technology and industry. Many of them are French, and Swiss, Schlumberger, Seydoux, and so on. The famous movie maker Jean-Luc Godard is a member of that group. So they decided that an experiment should be attempted, that it should not simply be finished and destroyed. So they proposed to create a new society, to which they gave enough money for the beginning, and they introduced a man whom you will see in the movie, who plays an extremely important role. This man is called Claude Neuschwander. He's a typical grand bourgeois, French grand bourgeois. Look at his hands; they are so elegant, you know. And he's a technocrat. But he's a left-wing technocrat. So Claude Neuschwander accepted to become the manager of a new industrial complex, which agreed to progressively hire back all the workers, one after the other, progressively as the production would start again, provided the workers on their side agreed to give back the famous war treasury that they had kept and hidden, namely the watches, and even pay back a sort of compensation that, because in particular shops, I mean shopkeepers throughout France were absolutely furious that the workers sell watches at a lower price, of course, and etc., etc. So that's the second phase, of which we don't see much in terms of the description of the production process itself, but we see the whole discussion. And essentially the factory during that period was run, I would say, in capitalist manner. There was a boss and there was a manager, but the trade unions and more than the Comité d'Action were so powerful that it became a kind of, it's not a cooperative, but it's a kind of joint, I would say, in German you call it Mitbestimmung or something like that. It's a kind of co-gestion, the term in French. And the factory, the power in the factory was somehow shared, I would say, by the manager and the workers. And that lasted until the middle of that lasted until the beginning of 1976. And at this moment, and I finish with that, sorry I was too long, but perhaps that's useful, I hope. At the beginning of 1976, a new president had been elected, a man called Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who is in fact the first very very conscious representatives of what was later called neoliberalism as an economic and political theory. And Giscard d'Estaing absolutely did not want this to continue one more minute. So you'll see another interesting figure in the film is the former left Gaullist Minister of Industry, Mr. Charbonnel, who later took part in controversies about all that, and said, so he was a minister, a Gaullist minister, but he said the state decided to kill Lippe. Ils ont assassiné Lippe. And the way to kill Lippe was the following. First, the state cancelled all the orders, les commandes, is that order in English? Yeah. Yes. All the orders of the important orders of clocks and other technical instruments that it had passed or made to leave. So suddenly, overnight, these orders were cancelled. Second, they they instructed banks to refuse loans and credits to the factory, which says something about the independence of free enterprise, etc., etc. And finally, of course, the same progressive capitalists who had wanted to invent a new form of cogestion between workers and bosses sacked their own man. The manager, Claude Neuschwander, whom you will see in the etc. So I'll stop there because that's what the movie shows, plus reflection about all that. But the story was not finished. There were other episodes. Eventually, of course, at this point, the workers started a new strike. They even tried again to produce without their war treasury. And then the police again came in, and then they were forced to accept an industrial selling of the factory to another society which fired a number of workers. They created cooperatives. This is not shown in the and finally it was bought. It's become part of a big industrial group, bigger industrial group. Now the protagonists that you will see in the movie, and I stop there, are trade unionists. They made the most important of them, remarkable man called Charles Piaget. There are several trade unionists. And some women as well. Fatima de Mongeau, she's a spectacular personality. And another woman who is, so these, the main protagonists among the trade unionists are members of the trade union called CFDT, which means Confédération Française Démocratique du Travail. It's a Christian, originally a Christian trade union, which at some point sometime earlier, decided to drop the affiliation to religious references, but retaining something of the spirit of the so-called social theory of the church. So they're not they're not communists, they are not anarchists, they are not CGT. But you also have a woman who is the CGT, who is the communist-linked trade union, also, of course, had some importance in the factory. So you also see another woman who is from that group. And then beside the trade unionists, you have a very strange, striking personage and figure. I find him a little self-complacent, but nevertheless he's quite remarkable. This is a leftist Dominican priest called Jean Raguenès. You'll see him, who in fact had been an active participant of the May 68 events and had become a worker in that factory and was, in a sense, the leader. You always have leaders, apparently need leaders of the Comité d'Action, that is not the organized trade union, but the more spontaneous, etc. And then you have the manager, Claude Neuschwander, and you have the minister. Okay, I think that's enough.
Okay. All right. Merci. Thank you, Étienne. So why don't we get the film going, and then after that we'll have a talkback conversation.
Lip vous garantit l'heure exacte au troisième top, exactement 13h. Au troisième top, 13h, Lip, c'est l'heure.
L'arrêt de l'entreprise, c'est vrai que ça a été la panique générale.
Parce qu'on n'était pas encore une époque où on larguait les hommes, quoi. Comme ça, comme des bêtes.
On s'est concerté en disant qu'est-ce qu'on va faire.
Il faut prendre le pas et occuper. Je ne me rappelle même plus lequel qui a dit, mais si on prenait des montres en otage.
Où est la légalité déjà? Elle est où? Est-ce que c'est le fait de perdre son emploi ou est-ce que c'est le fait qu'on prenne ce qui nous appartient?
On n'a plus qu'une seule chose à faire, c'est remettre en route les chaînes d'horlogerie.
On a dit, tout le monde peut venir voir, écouter, partout dans l'usine.
On va faire souder les portes ouverte.
Et même une nuit, on est venu me rechercher à 11h du soir pour faire visiter l'usine à 2 quarts de pèlerins qui remontaient de Lourdes.
Mais qu'est-ce qui se passe dans cette entreprise? Qui c'est qui commande?
Alors maintenant, tranquillement, et tous ensemble, nous allons aller toucher notre pays.
C'est pas écrit tout ça. Puis ça peut pas s'écrire.
Je dis libre, c'est fini. Je répète que libre, c'est fini.
Je suis passée ici, mettre un jean, parce que j'étais en mini-jupe, je me voyais pas supporter un assaut de CRS en mini-jupe.
C'est pas des murs, l'usine, c'est d'abord des travailleurs.
Et puis, il y a eu le jour où les premiers ouvriers sont revenus dans l'usine.
Jamais on n'aurait pu penser que d'avoir enlevé des montres et d'avoir mis une banderole, on fabrique, on vend, on se paye, allait faire un tel cirque en France et dans d'autres pays.
Le problème actuellement, il est de savoir si on a la volonté de repartir avec le potentiel humain ici, ou si on veut repartir avec le seul intérêt économique, le seul intérêt du profit.
All right. So I thought it would just be nice to have a few moments to think together about the film. So I have a number of questions, but maybe I'll start with 3, or we'll start the discussion and open it up for anyone else who wants to jump in as well. But to begin with, Étienne, when we met and first talked about this film this summer, you told me about the time that you went to Besançon. You drove a car.
Sorry.
You had a friend. You were a colleague who told you this was the future and you had to go down there.
No, this would be a long story, but you're mixing two different stories. I told you, mixing live, which for me is very important, but I not only was a part of that clearly, but I never went there, as so many other students, intellectuals, and so on. The story I told you was in another one in '68, and when it's true, during the general strike, I received a phone call from a Maoist friend who was also, of course, Normandien. He was assistant professor at the time at the University of Besançon, and he says to me, "The revolution has just begun. We created the first Soviet of students and workers, but not workers from this relatively medium-sized watch factory, but from a huge chemical factory in the same area." So we had lots of disagreements because I was not a Maoist myself, I was still in the Communist Party, with another friend who said to us that if the revolution has begun, we must be there. So at the time, the problem, of course, was that you had no gas. It was a general strike, so we collected tanks, put all that in a very small car, and drove the whole day, actually, 4 people, to Besançon. And when we arrived there, the revolution was finished. because that's very interesting. It's because the leftist students with that idea of Soviet, they thought they would be admitted into the factory and start organizing for to take power with the workers. But the workers certainly were keen on talking to the students and making plans together. But if there was one thing they absolutely didn't want, it was the students to come into the factory and start touching everything and etc. So, of course, I stayed there for a whole week, and the university was in a state of permanent turmoil, and the General Assembly it's not the same.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll come back to some of those issues having to do with syndicalism and workers and the relationship to unions and the relationship to the work. There was one point in this movie when you said to me, "Ah, la lutte des classes." What was that moment?
It's not. It's the third or fourth time that I see this movie with interruptions. But I find everything fascinating. I hope you agree that these people are quite extraordinary. But the moment when, on one side, you have the representative of the Ministry for Industry, a polytechnicien, absolutely typical in Giraud, who's offering to restart the factory, but of course, and he doesn't want to give too many details, but the implicit idea is that not only everything will return to the normal hierarchic order, etc., but the bosses will be able to fire, to lay off as many workers as they want. And at this very moment, Piaget, the leader of the unions and spokesperson for all the work, and of course the interesting thing is that given the circumstances, the technocrat, I mean the official from the government, France is a small country, you know. So the government has to get involved in, it was also the atmosphere of the time. But he's not able to negotiate in behind closed doors. Everything is taking place in front of the whole assembly of the workers. And in the middle of them, the trade unionist raises and says, no way, these things are going to be run like that. I mean, we decide that we want all the workers to be hired again, and you're not going to dictate your law to us. So it reminds me of an extraordinary passage in Marx's Capital, Volume 1, about the class struggles over a different question, which is the length of the labor day. You know? And Marx has this extraordinary formula. It's interesting in German because the word has, he says force, he says right against right, what decides? Force. And then of course the Schroeder has this discourse about I did not ignore the class struggle, but at this point you see it.
Right. It's that moment, if you remember, when they're all in the Assemblée, really,
Yes.
And it's when Charles says something like, "Well, you're going to have to respect our human potential instead of just the profit,
Absolutely, you're absolutely right.
Right.
Yes, he puts the whole thing in those terms. Right. Whether the supreme value is profit,
human potential,
or potential,
right, or profit. Yeah. So another thing that I thought was particularly interesting was the way in which different political models are at play in the confrontation on the left. So the different political models, the way in which, for instance, the CGT, which is the communist union, led union, more so, the way they were resisting, they resisted so much. There was so much in this that they weren't, that they didn't feel comfortable with, right?
Sorry?
That they did not feel comfortable with.
They did not feel comfortable with they're accustomed to, one of them says it, the women's syndicalist from the CGT, they're accustomed to the idea that the class struggle precisely takes the form of very tough conflicts and confrontations, but in which the function of the unions and therefore the workers is to oppose in a kind of negative manner the will of the bosses, and not follow crazy utopian ideas of becoming their own masters in the factories. Which is also one of the reasons I hope I'm not. And then, of course, there are rivalries between the trade unions. But what's interesting is that, and one of them says it, Piaget, or etc., is that of course, the CFDT was majoritarian, and it was pushed by the Comité d'Action. They had kind of synergy, but and the idea, one of them also says the CGT woman unionist says that she was at odds with her national leadership because she was very attached to the tradition of unity among workers that derived from 68, and therefore, even if they didn't like very much all the revolutionary ideas, they didn't want to break
the social was what you're talking about. Right?
And if I may add only one thing, is that one point among the documents that are shown, you have the interventions of the two national leaders from the two great unions. So you have Mr. Edmond Maire, and after that you have Mr. Georges Segui. I have to say that for a number of reasons, Georges Segui is a very important figure for me, but in any case, the first, he's not a very good orator, etc. But the second, Segui, I don't know if you noticed that, the round man, etc., is really a kind of traditional French orator for great demonstrations. But this guy is a communist originally. You know, he became he entered politics as during the resistance as a 16 years old apprentice, etc., etc. So he has a long story behind him. And I can't help think, and what he says at this moment is this remarkable sentence, perhaps not invented by him. What is taking place now clearly demonstrates that the bosses, the capitalists need the workers, but the workers don't need the capitalists, which is a completely revolutionary formula. So I tend to believe that this is not pure rhetoric. He does believe that.
So this is kind of like this bricolage of a lot of different left strategies in a way. I mean, autogestion is not necessarily being a part traditionally of a CGT approach,
no, not at all.
right? Right. So I mean, what are all the different pieces that we find here? I mean, there is the autogestion. There is there's also this idea of forming self-management, self-governing, right?
It's certain, probably perhaps we talk about that tomorrow, but it certainly has affinities with the broad sense in which somebody like you takes the word cooperation. But in the language of the time, cooperation has a narrower, more technical sense. Certainly it has to do with the idea that you can organize work without the imposition of very coercive, hierarchic order. But it doesn't necessarily involve what is involved, what was at the time involved in the idea of autogestion, namely a combination of complete autonomy and radical democracy in the organization of work and the plans for the company. Right. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that this was not something that well, these ideas existed before. Perhaps some of the protagonists had participated, I would say, in that ideology, which owes more to utopian tradition than to Marxist concept of class struggle. But they essentially reach these, I would say, this high level of democratic self-management because they have no other choice. It's die or create.
Yeah, although in a way, right, they're charting this new path. I mean, they're deciding to chart the new path. I mean, and with a lot of different ways.
But at the same time, they're
opening the doors, for instance, right?
Sorry?
Opening the doors,
opening
right?
the doors.
For instance, I mean, bringing people in
Now that
rather than
would be very much against
right.
that.
That was, I mean, that was the whole right. That was the whole issue that we were just
Because
talking
the
about
word
in '68.
CGT, that's Christian, perhaps, to some extent. I mean, the CGT has very workerist tradition in the ordinary sense of the term. So the idea, and especially after '68, because during the '68 events, the clash or the discrepancy, I would say, of course, what made the events was a remarkable convergence of two movements, you might say. A huge working class general strike, blah, blah, on one side, and a kind of utopian emancipatory movement of the radical left made of students, intellectuals, and so on, and lots of other people, priests, doctors, everywhere some structure of hierarchical authority had existed. It was contested in May '68. But the drama, in the sense of '68, the best books about it, Christian Ross or others, show that very clearly, is that in the end, for social and ideological reasons, the two never completely merged. And that left some traces, I wouldn't say of resentment, but of suspicion. So that was very strong in the CGT, and clearly these, let's say, post-Christian trade unionists and perhaps workers had a much more open state of mind.
Right, yeah. And it's interesting to see.
Understood, which is true, they explained it, that one of the conditions for their movement to succeed was for it to become what it actually became during a few months, namely a kind of national symbol of confrontation with the power, and therefore a kind of rallying point for progressives and sympathetic people from all around the country.
Right. And certain forms of egalitarianism along, for instance, gender lines, right? also
reacted to some of the words which are ambivalent in this respect.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well. Yeah. I mean. A second wave, maybe a second wave of some kind, but also the idea of leaderlessness was interesting as it was coming through, also, which again is not typical necessarily of some of the syndicalism, but represented another something movement. So when Charles Piaget says, actually it felt almost as if we didn't need leaders anymore, right? When he'd left and then he realized nobody even had noticed that he had gone, right? So there are interesting ways in which the confrontation and the conflict within kind of the left gives different forms of equality.
I agree, but I don't do, I think our friends here should say something.
Yeah.
But I think that this is a blatant performative contradiction. The very moment it's true, it's absolutely true that these syndicalists, etc., found themselves forced to abandon some of their traditional ways of organizing, leading, centralizing initiatives and so on, and to let, the community or the mass of the workers have their say, and etc., etc. So nevertheless, if something is clear, it's that there are leaders, and even the Dominican priest, I should have said that he's publicity, but who is a radical egalitarian anarchist, Ivan Illich, and so on and so on. He's a leader, like it or not. I don't know if you feel the same.
What do you think? Let's open it up for reactions and thoughts. I want to give Leah an opportunity to jump in first because of all her work and many times that you've seen the film. Let me pass you the mic.
Yeah, I thought leaders were an interesting point because even though eventually the outcome and what they say is the success is leaderlessness, in a way the struggle would have been possible without the leaders to embody the struggle.
That means there are different types of leaders. I strongly believe that.
Yes, but I was wondering, because we've talked about different types of cooperation since the beginning of the seminar, and I was wondering if you thought that, the idea of cooperation that you've described in your book or in other sessions that we've discussed, if you thought that this kind of cooperation embodied by leaders and by trade unions and these kinds of struggles that in a way also take the risk of reproducing patterns of oppression, in the sense that at the beginning women were silenced, and I was just wondering if you thought that this was the exact same type of cooperation as what we have talked about since the beginning of the seminar, or if this was different because there's trade unions involved and because of this particular struggle. And also I wanted to point out that it was also interesting to see, because at one point the minister is saying that they have a particular therapy for lip, that they have to find a particular therapy for lip. And I thought it was interesting to see how much of an existential threat cooperation, when it becomes tangible and when it becomes real, how much of an existential threat it is for the system, because the first argument against cooperation is to say it's not possible, it's not feasible, it's utopia, it's crazy. And so I thought that this was a perfect example, just like La ZAD Notre-Dame-des-Landes was, that whenever cooperation becomes real and tangible, you understand how much of a threat it is. And I was wondering, because in 2017 in France there was a similar crisis. What it was the company Whirlpool or something. It was during the presidential elections. There was at some point a massive media moment where candidate Macron and Marine Le Pen both had to go talk to workers because there were about to be a lot of layoffs, etc. But at the end of the day, these workers got, they lost their jobs and there wasn't the same social movements that were similar. So I was wondering why you thought that this was possible, in the 1970s, and that with like social support, public opinion support, that now these kind of similar events are like non-events to most people.
Well, that's first a lot of great connections and then some complicated questions. I thought one moment that struck me in the film was at the end when the boss who comes in so clear about class conflict and says there can be no cooperation, right? There can be no cooperation between the working class and management. I thought that was striking. But what I felt throughout the film, and in part that's why I was asking some of these questions, was that this was an experiment in a way. It was a shock experiment in a particular context where certain forms of cooperation start to emerge as possibilities. And it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit in the clean-cut kind of worker cooperative mode because of the difficulties that produced this moment. But I think that there were lots of different interesting forms of cooperation that take place during this. Some of which are, you were mentioning resistance techniques, right? But some of which were the whole idea of stealing the inventory of 60,000 watches, or of taking the inventory of 60,000 watches, which, remember, they were, well, as the priest was saying, this was your product. This was you made these watches, so you're not stealing them, right? You're taking the inventory. But then the way in which they were placed, right? It was an extraordinary amount of cooperation, right? It was unwritten. It was filling cars, putting them away, people remembering where they were, stashed in, right? It was unspoken cooperation that was going on there, right?
It's also a moment in which they probably believe themselves to be a kind of adventure movie, you know?
Right. They must have felt that way for sure.
Driving cars at night, hiding from the.
And then there are forms of cooperation that emerge when they start resuming some operations, not all the operations, but like resuming the assembly of certain watches or selling, right? These are all, and you have to realize there were forms of cooperation in the sense that there was a lot of cash coming in, and it had to be put in certain places and then used for payment of the salaries and whatnot. That's a huge operation with 1,000 or so people, right? How do you even remake the kind of the distribution of cash in that way?
Perhaps we'll talk about that tomorrow if some of you are still there. But my technological knowledge is very, very thin. Although at a certain point in earlier life, when I was avidly reading not only Marx's chapters on cooperation, I might say a few things about that tomorrow, and the Industrial Revolution, the transition from the manufacturer, making watches a typical example of what Marx calls manufacture, and to the so-called fabric. So I learned workers, but also to technicians in different fields. So all this to say that there are some things which remain enigmatic to me. I would very much like to have, I would say, an expert, somebody who's knowledgeable about this kind of fabrication to give his advice. What did they exactly restart? It's a question of the assembly line. So, and it was said at the beginning that this factory had a remarkable characteristic, namely they were making themselves a very high percentage, 80% of the constituents of the watches, which is the absolute opposite of today's dissemination of the chains of value, etc., etc. So what did they exactly restart? Assembling, because it doesn't last very long, 100%. And also it's not yet the time of the so-called continuous flow production that we have today. So they must have had, I suspect, they must have had pieces already made which they only had to assemble. But I'm not sure that they could reorganize the complete process of the production with the totality of the functions of the industrial process.
Right. That's what one of
and
them had said.
And even more when at this moment, of course, there's this extraordinary motto, the factory. So that's again a splendid formula which says something about capital and labor. I mean, the factory is not where the walls are. The factory is where the workers are. And since the workers are no longer inside the walls, but they are in the city of Besançon, we'll recreate the factory in the city of Besançon. What does that exactly mean? They don't have the machines there. So they perhaps transfer some elements of, but it's, the technology is something material.
Right.
You cannot invent at will.
Right. Yeah.
And cooperation also has to do with that.
Who else wants to jump in? Some thoughts, reactions, something that really struck you from the film, from the experience? Yes, Andre Petman.
Thank you for this discussion. Something I was thinking about watching the film, I think that really came through towards the end. I was thinking a lot about Simon Weil's writing song.
Simon Weil.
Writing after sequestration and strikes. At least in her writing, I think she really underscores how much of a joyous experience this is.
And see, yes. Go ahead. I'll speak.
I think I was quite struck by, in many of the interviews, people seemed they were moved almost to tears. They felt a bit emotional looking back on this experience, regardless of really where they stood in certain parts of the endeavor. People who were no longer involved, still who were maybe upset that they were no longer involved, still look back on this as sort of the more defining moments of their lives. So I was just curious to hear maybe some of how this relates to cooperation.
Simon Weil's journal, which has just been republished in a new edition with a very interesting commentary. Simon Weil's experience is a fundamental moment, of course, in the interaction or intersection of philosophy and labor and class struggle. So what she describes is a kind of industrial work which is totally terrorized and amounting to torture. And it's physically unbearable. Of course, she's a she's a weak person with an incredible will, but what she describes is true. The workers are physically destroyed by the kind of work that they are doing on these assembly lines. You have the same in Charles Chaplin's famous Modern Times, except it's presented as funny to be running after the line that accelerates, etc. Whereas, of course, in practice, it's anything but funny. I also suggest that you perhaps see, I wanted to show it here when I was teaching a class some years ago, an extraordinary Italian movie, which is called La classe operaia va in paradiso. The working class goes to paradise, with Gian Maria Volonte as the main actor. It's absolutely incredible. It's about the same period, etc. But this is industrial work which destroys the bodies. So you don't have the. I'm not saying that the works these people or women in particular were doing on their individual machines or établi or how do you call it, desk something, was a workshop was fun, was pleasure, but it's clearly not that. So there are interesting indications at the beginning when Charles Piaget says we started to slow down the production, and that's not possible because the body of the worker is completely adapted to a certain rhythm and so on. So the relationship between the machine, the work, and the labor and the body is always central, crucial. But it's miles away from what Simone Weil describes, I believe, or Robert Linat, my friend and my comrade in L'Établi, which has become known as a kind of sequel to Simone Weil's experience. But that's a great reference, fundamental.
Yeah, great. I think we need to wrap up. So just on a few thoughts. First on Simone Weil, we've got a session on her on November 29th, I think it is. So we'll be turning specifically to those writings, Andre. So I'm looking forward to that.
And you know what I always find extremely moving, perhaps because I've been trained in that old-fashioned kind of humanities, but is that in the very middle of her journal, when she wants to give this condition, this dire condition of the worker, a literary expression, she quotes two verses from Homer's Iliad in Greek.
So we'll turn to Simone Weil at the end of November, and then the last thought I had was that there's a moment in the film when I forget who it was talking. It might have been it was one of the. I think it was maybe Raymond Burgier or someone else. They was talking about moi me payer moi-même mon salaire, que ce soit légitime, or peut-être c'était Michel, l'autre caractère, but this idea that what seemed to give everyone a frisson was the fact of being able to pay themselves their salary, right? And of course that raises a fascinating question about cooperation and cooperatives and worker cooperatives in relationship to larger questions of social transformation and socialism, etc. That I think we will be taking up tomorrow.
Okay.
So, thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you, Étienne, for the comments and the feedback and for inspiring this screening. Thank you, Fanny, so much for all the organization, Kiana as well. And Leah, thank you for making it possible for everyone to read it in English. Thank you so much, and thanks. And see you tomorrow at 6:15 here, where we will continue the conversation. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks.